The Sea of Japan at 10:14 a.m. was deep and cold, and exactly the shade of gray-green that appeared in every Pacific Fleet weather brief for this latitude in late autumn. The U.S. destroyer was on a transit heading northeast, 80 nautical miles off the Japanese coast, in international waters that both Japan and the Russian Federation maintained surveillance of at all times and for different reasons. Japan monitored this corridor because it was the approach to the Tsugaru Strait. Russia monitored it because it was the Pacific Fleet's operational front yard, the water whose western shore held Vladivostok, whose submarines transited at depth, whose strategic value was measured in the same currency as every other contested sea lane in the Pacific. The destroyer was making 16 knots on course 044. Lawful, documented, routine. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force had been notified. 7th Fleet had the track. At 10:14 a.m., the circumstances changed. Bridge CIC. New surface contact bearing 018, range 7 nautical miles. Contact is a large platform, classification consistent with Udaloy-class destroyer, Pacific Fleet configuration. Speed 22 knots. Current track heading 205. Contact is on a converging course with our position. Converging. Not intercept, converging. The specific distinction was navigational and tactically significant. An intercept course meant the adversary vessel was heading toward the U.S. ship's current position. A converging course meant the adversary vessel was heading toward a point that the U.S. ship was also heading toward, a point in the water that both vessels would reach at approximately the same time from different directions. The officer of the deck reached for the intercom. At 10:16 a.m., the captain stepped onto the bridge. He studied the Udaloy's track, the converging geometry, the time to the crossing point. He noted the bearing, 018, forward of the U.S. destroyer's beam. That bearing, combined with the Udaloy's course of 205, created the specific COLREGS geometry where the Udaloy was the stand-on vessel. International maritime law, the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea, universally known as COLREGS, governed how vessels interacted when their courses converged and created risk of collision. COLREGS was not a suggestion. It designated for every possible configuration of two converging vessels, which had the obligation to give way and which had the right to maintain course and speed. The give-way vessel was required to take early and substantial action to avoid collision. The stand-on vessel was required to maintain course and speed. The Russian Pacific Fleet had identified a specific exploitation available within this framework. If a Russian warship could establish itself as the stand-on vessel in a converging scenario with a U.S. destroyer, clearly and early, with navigation lights correctly displayed and course and speed entirely consistent with its COLREGS rights, then the U.S. destroyer became the give-way vessel. And the give-way vessel was required by international law to alter course, not by Russian doctrine, by the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea. The maneuver was the stand-on press. He had seen this in the briefing materials, in the Pacific Fleet doctrine assessments, in the intelligence product produced after 2 prior incidents in the Sea of Japan where Russian Pacific Fleet vessels had executed this maneuver and the U.S. ships had altered course. Those alterations had appeared in Russian operational assessments as evidence that the maneuver worked. They had appeared in Pacific Fleet doctrine reviews as lessons to address. He was the address. I have the con. He turned to the CIC intercom. Give me the Udaloy's exact course and bearing from us, and tell me the crossing point. The CIC tactical officer reported within 90 seconds. Udaloy's course 205, speed 22 knots. Our course 044, speed 16 knots. Crossing point approximately 2.8 nautical miles northeast of our current position. Time to crossing point, 10 minutes, 15 seconds for us. 9 minutes, 55 seconds for the Udaloy. The Udaloy reaches the crossing point approximately 20 seconds before us at current speeds. 20 seconds. The Udaloy would reach the crossing point 20 seconds before the destroyer at current speeds. Under COLREGS, the U.S. destroyer was the give-way vessel, and the give-way vessel, under Rule 16, was required to take early and substantial action to keep well clear. CPA 10 minutes. Time pressure was building. At 10:17 a.m., the Udaloy activated its AIS transponder. Not surprising, the Udaloy had been running without AIS until this moment, standard Pacific Fleet practice in the Sea of Japan. The AIS activation at 10:17 a.m. was the specific moment Russian doctrine required. By broadcasting its course, speed, and identity on the international maritime system, the Udaloy created a navigational record. Any subsequent inquiry would have its track clearly documented from this moment. The documentation established that the Udaloy had been on its stated course and speed, maintaining its rights as the stand-on vessel, fully compliant with COLREGS. The AIS activation was the Udaloy's lawyers arriving on the scene. The captain noted the timing. He turned to the officer of the deck. "What's the JMSDF destroyer's position?" 22 nautical miles bearing 235. JMSDF is in their assigned patrol box. 22 nautical miles. The JMSDF vessel was watching on radar, not in a position to intervene in the next 10 minutes. The Sea of Japan at 10:17 a.m. was a two-ship problem, and the legal framework governing the encounter was telling the U.S. destroyer to turn. CPA, 140 yards. Time, 9 minutes, 20 seconds. At 10:18 a.m., the first friction event arrived. The JMSDF destroyer had initiated a communication on the bilateral tactical circuit. U.S. vessel, we are observing the Udaloy approach. Russian vessel appears to be on a heading consistent with a COLREGS stand-on position. We are monitoring and can coordinate if needed. Your call. 3 sentences. The third, your call, was doing the work of an entire tactical assessment. The Japanese commanding officer was confirming that he saw the geometry, understood it, and was deferring to the U.S. captain. He was saying, "I see it. You decide." The captain acknowledged and returned to the radar display. The decision was already in place. He was working through its implementation. CPA 130 yards. Time to CPA 9 minutes. The problem with yielding to the stand-on press was not legal. It was strategic. COLREGS Rule 16 was clear about the giveaway vessel's obligation, but legally obligated to alter course and strategically required to yield the transit lane were not the same thing. The Russian maneuver had separated the legal from the strategic, had made the legal instrument into the mechanism that produced the strategic outcome. This was its operational genius, its vulnerability. COLREGS Rule 17 also stated that the stand-on vessel shall not take any action to impede the crossing vessel so as to cause a collision. A vessel that deliberately steered to create a COLREGS scenario, that constructed the geometry specifically to force another vessel to alter course, was not exercising rights under COLREGS. It was weaponizing COLREGS. The distinction was judicable, but it had to be argued after the fact, not managed in real time. In real time, the captain had 9 minutes and a crossing point 2.5 nautical miles ahead. He stood at the center bridge window and looked at the Udaloy. Visible at 6 nautical miles as a low dark shape against the gray-green water, moving with the unhurried authority of a vessel that believed the legal situation was already resolved in its favor. The vessel was correct about the legal situation. COLREGS Rule 16 was not ambiguous. He was the giveaway vessel. He was required to act. He was also aware that the Udaloy's commanding officer was watching his radar display with the same attention he was applying to the Udaloy's course, watching for the alteration that would confirm the maneuver had worked, that would appear in the encounter record as the U.S. destroyer altering course in response to Russian navigational pressure. 28 years of sea time had given him a specific kind of clarity about moments like this. The clarity of someone who had been told what to do by the law and who understood that how you did it was the only space available for strategy. He would comply with the law. He would document the compliance in a way that made the compliance mean something different from what the Udaloy was watching for. At 10:20 a.m., the captain transmitted on Channel 16. Russian warship bearing 018 from us. This is a United States warship on a lawful transit in international waters of the Sea of Japan. We are aware of your position and track. We are conducting a COLREGS analysis of this situation. Be advised that our COLREGS assessment indicates the current geometry was established from your maneuvering at 10:14 local. We have the full track record from initial detection. We will manage this situation in accordance with COLREGs and with the documentation of how this geometry was created. Maintain your current course and speed. The broadcast did two things. It placed in the encounter record on Channel 16 being monitored by the JMSDF destroyer, by Japanese maritime listening posts, by every intelligence service running collection on the Sea of Japan, that the U.S. destroyer had documented the geometry's origin. The statement, "The current geometry was established from your maneuvering at 1014 local," would appear in any subsequent maritime assessment of this encounter, followed by the radar track data. Second, "We will manage this situation in accordance with COLREGs," was not, "We will alter course." Managing in accordance with COLREGs included every option available to both vessels. CPA 120 yards. Time to CPA 8 minutes. The Udaloy did not respond on Channel 16. Its silence was its position. Course 205. Speed 22. AIS active. Navigation lights correctly displayed. Stand on vessel. Maintaining. At 10:21 a.m., the fire control radar entered active tracking mode on the Udaloy, not as a collision avoidance measure, as a signal. The fire control radar told the Udaloy's bridge what the Channel 16 broadcast had told the encounter record. This was a tactical standoff, not a navigational inconvenience. The electromagnetic message accompanying the legal documentation. The CIWS completed its power on and entered passive thermal tracking mode. The barrel oriented toward the Udaloy. As the Udaloy moved, the barrel moved. CPA 115 yards. Time to CPA 7 minutes. At 10:23 a.m., the second friction event arrived. 7th Fleet Pacific Operations Center had sent a priority message. Its substance, the encounter was being monitored at theater level. The 7th Fleet Judge Advocate was engaged on the specific legal question whether the U.S. destroyer, as the COLREGs giveaway vessel, was legally required to alter course. Assessment forthcoming in 4 minutes. 4 minutes. The CPA was 7 minutes away. The timing was workable. The JMSDF destroyer transmitted, "We have the picture. We are closing your position at 18 knots. ETA 12 minutes." The Japanese commanding officer had made his own decision. He was coming. He could not arrive before the CPA, but his movement toward the position was visible on the AIS network to the Russian Pacific Fleet. CPA 110 yards. Time to CPA 6 minutes 20 seconds. The JAG assessment arrived at 10:25 a.m. 3 paragraphs. First, under COLREGS Rule 16, the U.S. destroyer, as the giveaway vessel, had an obligation to take early and substantial action to keep well clear. That obligation was not discretionary. Second, COLREGS Rule 2, the responsibility rule, provided that nothing in the COLREGs exonerated a vessel from neglect of precautions required by ordinary seamanship. Rule 2 recognized that seamanship judgment must be applied. Third, the documented origin of the geometry, the Udaloy's deliberate maneuver at 10:14 a.m., was a material factor in any subsequent legal analysis. The U.S. Channel 16 broadcast documenting this origin was legally significant. The JAG assessed that a minimal course alteration, sufficient to demonstrate COLREG's compliance without yielding the transit lane, was the option that preserved both the legal obligation and the strategic record. A minimal course alteration, sufficient to demonstrate compliance, not a withdrawal. CPA 110 yards. Time to CPA 5 minutes 40 seconds. Come left 5 degrees. Speed increase to 20 knots. 5 degrees to port. 4 knots of additional speed. The course change from 044 to 039 opened the CPA from 110 yards to approximately 320 yards, while creating a documented record. The U.S. destroyer had complied with COLREGS Rule 16 by taking action to keep well clear. The action was minimal, documented, and executed under fire control radar tracking with a JAG assessment in hand. The helmsman executed the course change precisely. He had been on the wheel since 0800, 2 hours and 23 minutes of course 044, and the order that arrived at 10:26 a.m. was 5 degrees to port and 20 knots. Not 6, not 4. 5 degrees was the number the captain had said. 5 degrees was the documented number in the JAG assessment, the minimum compliant action. 5 degrees was what the helmsman held, with the precision that minimum meant minimum and not approximately minimum. His hands moved the wheel and held the new course, and the course held. 039 at 20 knots. At 10:26 a.m., the Udaloy transmitted on Channel 16. One sentence in English. United States warship, we acknowledge your course and speed adjustment. We are maintaining our current navigation. Acknowledging the U.S. course adjustment. The Udaloy's first and only transmission. It documented for its own record that the U.S. vessel had altered course. The stand-on press had produced its documented outcome. The U.S. record was different. A vessel that had documented the geometry's deliberate origin before taking any action. That had executed the minimum COLREGS-compliant action under fire control radar tracking and JAG guidance. That had transmitted the specific statement, the current geometry was established from your maneuvering at 10:14 local, before the alteration, not after. The U.S. record was not a record of yielding the transit lane. It was a record of managing a deliberately constructed legal scenario with minimum compliance. The TEL appeared at 10:27 a.m. The Udaloy adjusted course, 3 degrees to the east, away from the original converging geometry. The CPA projection, which had opened to 320 yards following the U.S. course change, expanded further, 380 yards, then 420. The Udaloy had made its clearing adjustment. The maneuver was complete. Udaloy altering course 3 degrees east. CPA now opening, projecting 420 yards and increasing. The captain watched the Udaloy's track shift on the radar display. Not dramatically. 3 degrees, bearing drift visible over successive sweeps, moving away from the crossing point. At 10:29 a.m., the fire control radar entered standby. The CIWS returned to passive. The CPA was 480 yards in opening. The JMSDF destroyer received a transmission from the U.S. destroyer. Situation has resolved. Udaloy has cleared the crossing point. You may resume your patrol station. Thank you for your coordination. Japanese response. Understood. Well done. Resuming station. 2 sentences. Well done. A brief transmission from a professional who had watched a technically demanding situation be managed correctly. No one on the bridge spoke for a long moment. The Sea of Japan, at 10:29 a.m., was the same Sea of Japan it had been at 10:14 a.m. Gray-green, deep, cold, watched by the same intelligence apparatus that had been watching it when the watch began. The Udaloy's bearing was now northeast and opening at its normal Pacific Fleet operational pace, as if the stand-on press had been an episode rather than a defeat, as if the geometry that had been constructed at 10:14 a.m. and resolved at 10:27 a.m. was simply one more data point in the long statistical record of how the Sea of Japan worked. The Pacific Fleet ran encounters in these waters. The Pacific Fleet logged the outcomes. The outcomes accumulated into patterns. The patterns informed the next commanding officer who encountered the same geometry in these waters. This encounter was now part of that record. In the CIC, the tactical officer was completing the radar track annotation, marking the specific moment of the Udaloy's 10:14 a.m. course change on the track history, the AIS activation at 10:17 a.m., the fire control radar activation at 10:21 a.m., the U.S. 5-degree course change at 10:26 a.m., the Udaloy's 3-degree clearing change at 10:27 a.m. Each annotation was a timestamp and a bearing and a speed. Together, they told the story of a geometry that had been constructed, documented, legally managed, and cleared. The doctrine implications note that the captain had requested for the Pacific Fleet Assessment Team would accompany the track data. Someone, in an office somewhere in the Pacific Fleet chain of command, was going to read about the stand-on press in the 5-degree response and the Channel 16 broadcast that pre-documented the geometry's origin. That person was going to understand that the stand-on press had a counter, and that the counter was documentation before compliance, and that the counter was available to any commanding officer who understood the specific legal framework well enough to operate within it rather than around it. The Sea of Japan encounter would be one page in a doctrine review that mattered beyond its own resolution. The helmsman was at course 039 and 20 knots, 5 degrees from the original heading. The maneuver was complete. The 5 degrees were 5 degrees that the captain had authorized with a JAG assessment and a Channel 16 broadcast and a fire control radar and tracking mode, documented before the first degree of alteration was executed. The officer of the deck looked at the radar display. The Udaloy at 560 yards and opening. The Sea of Japan, the same deep gray green it had been at 10:14 a.m. He straightened his collar. The captain walked to the chart table. The encounter report would go to 7th Fleet, Pacific Fleet, the U.S. Embassy Tokyo, and the JAG office. The report included the full radar track, the Udaloy's 10:14 a.m. geometry construction, the AIS activation at 10:17 a.m., the Channel 16 exchange, the fire control radar activation, the minimal COLREGS-compliant course change, and the Udaloy's subsequent clearing maneuver. Resume course 044. Resume 16 knots. A pause. Full encounter report to 7th Fleet. Include the complete radar track with the 1014 geometry creation documented, the JAG assessment, and the Channel 16 transcript in full. I want the doctrine implications captured for the Pacific Fleet assessment team. He turned toward the sea cabin. Good watch. The record assembled here speaks in the language the ocean keeps. One Russian Pacific Fleet Udaloy-class destroyer constructed a COLREGS stand-on position geometry against a U.S. destroyer in the Sea of Japan at 10:14 a.m. by deliberately altering course to a converging heading designed to create a situation where the U.S. vessel was legally obligated to give way under international maritime regulations. Geometry construction time, 10:14 a.m. AIS activation by Udaloy, 10:17 a.m. U.S. Destroyer Channel 16. Broadcast documenting geometry origin 10:20 a.m. before any course change was executed. Original CPA on converging courses 110 yards. CPA after U.S. 5-degree course change 320 yards. CPA after Udaloy clearing course change 480 yards and opening. U.S. minimal course change 5 degrees to port. Legal basis, COLREGS, Rule 16, giveaway obligation with Rule 2 seamanship judgment applied. JAG assessment received and incorporated, yes. Net transit heading deviation, 0 to 5 degrees returned after Udaloy cleared. Fire control radar activated in tracking mode on Udaloy, yes. CIWS passive tracking, yes. Weapons authorized, no. Weapons released, no. Channel 16, broadcasts from Udaloy. 1. Acknowledging the U.S. course adjustment. U.S. Channel 16 broadcast. 1. Documenting the deliberate geometry construction before any action was taken. 7th Fleet monitoring. Yes. JMSDF destroyer coordination. Yes. JAG assessment incorporated. Yes. COLREGS is the legal framework that prevents collisions. It is not the legal framework that governs freedom of navigation. The stand-on press exploits the gap between those two frameworks. The gap was documented before any action was taken. 5 degrees closed the legal gap. The record closed the strategic one.